So thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We've put together a pretty interesting and relevant topic today, discussing the minimum standard of cyber prevention. We put together a panel here who you'll be introduced to shortly, of various backgrounds within the cyber insurance and cybersecurity space, with all sorts of different insights, both from a carrier side, broker side, and cybersecurity expert. Brief agenda, we'll introduce you to our panel here, and then we will dive right into the topics we're planning to discuss today. Again, insurance company and underwriter insight, so understanding how they are looking at it from an underwriting standpoint, how we are looking at it and other brokers are looking at it from a broker insight. And then lastly, talking about the outsourced cybersecurity insight, some of the remediation and controls to put in place to bolster your cybersecurity presence. And then we'll go on with a couple questions. So without further ado, gentlemen, if you could introduce yourselves, we'll go left to right, starting with Gary.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gary Salmon, CEO of Blocktown Security. Thanks a lot for including me in on this presentation. A little bit about my background. I've been in the IT and security space for about 30 years. I built one of the very first cloud systems back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I focus on prevention, helping businesses of all sizes, small little mom and pop shops up to multi-billion-dollar companies prevent cyber attacks, ransomware events, etc. And then I also unfortunately deal with the aftermath. So our company specializes in digital forensics and incident response. So we, unfortunately have to go into many businesses and clean up the aftermath of these types of attacks. So, I have experience on both sides, both the prevention and the recovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
My name's Travis Whitmill with Evolve MGA. We're a cyber liability MGA, so we're on the cyber insurance side of things. Evolve is headquartered out of San Francisco, California. We've been around for about 7 to 8 years now. I've been with the firm for 5.5 to 6. I manage retail broker relationships all over the place, primarily East Coast. KMRD has been a great partner of ours over the last few years, and looking forward to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Travis.
Thanks, Bryan Tierney here. Currently with Sompo International. I've been on the underwriting side, so work for carriers assessing cyber risks since the early 2000s. Obviously, the market's changed a whole bunch since then, so learned a lot along the way. Currently, I lead a team of folks in the MidAtlantic territory for Sompo and another one out in New England. And we partner with all types of cyber vendors and brokers to transfer the risk for our clients and make sure that if something goes awry, that it's handled properly.
Thanks, Bryan. Chris?
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Quirk. I'm a wholesale broker. Generally means I'm a broker's broker. So retail brokers like KMRD would come to someone like me for specialization or market access. I personally specialize in cyber and have done it since 2014. We can write clients, publicly traded Fortune 500 companies, all the way down to your mom and pop corner shop. So I've been doing it since 2014, and I specialize in cyber and do very little else. So I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Chris. Mr. Hune, why don't you give yourself, I don't have your pretty mug up on the page here, but why don't you?
No, we're glad to be able to present this panelist of experts. These are all people that KMRD does business with. If hopefully you're familiar already with KMRD because the invite came from us, but we're obviously outsourced risk managers and insurance brokers. And we just thought this was a pretty important topic for not only our clients, but potential clients. And executives that I speak to on a daily basis tell me what's going on with the cyber market and cyber insurance. And so we thought this was a pretty timely discussion. So we hope that you get some really good takeaways out of this conversation.
Great, thank you. And with that, let's dive into the content here. So from an insurance company and underwriting insight, we have a couple questions here, and we can start with Travis and Bryan. Right now, current present market, what does your organization require to underwrite besides a cyber application?
Yeah,
Bryan, you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. And sorry, I just had a helicopter literally landing behind me, so hopefully it's not distracting anyone. Good question. And first I would start with the application process itself, right? So, over time, we've seen different iterations of kind of the approach taken here. And for a period of time, the application process was always pressured to be streamlined, right? Whether that was from clients or from brokers. And then, frankly, the market kind of complied. So essentially what started to happen is we didn't get tremendous insight into maybe some of the controls and procedures that we needed to. And over time, as discussions started to happen internally on the boards of the insurance carriers that were taking on this risk, there started to become big concern with potential for systemic exposure. So in order to address those concerns, applications, those concerns along with the actual changing in the risk atmosphere, applications became much broader, right? Much broader in scope. And, with mixed feedback from clients, the ones that I've seen take a healthy approach to the process really use the process as a tool to assess their cyber hygiene, right? So on the high level, the types of things that we're looking for through that process is one, to get a gauge on what kind of IT budget's in place. Of that, what's allocated specifically to cybersecurity? Is there a structure in-house for corporate governance to address the exposures? What does that look like, and who do they report to? Ideally, we want to see the C-suite reporting into the board and making sure that there's an atmosphere internally where everybody's involved with keeping the corporation safe, right? We want to understand any recent incidents, any past incidents, what those were, and if any remediations were implemented because of those. Data classification's big, right? So what types of information do you all have? And since you now understand what types of information do you have, you could also start to look at how you protect it, right? So we would be looking for those types of things as well. Access management to your networks, that's big nowadays. With remote access, especially during COVID, the popular terminology for multi-factor authentication became like a baseline for underwriting. So we want to know what your network looks like, who are you granting access to, and then how you manage that access, right? So you'll hear about MFA, you'll hear about privileged access management, you'll hear about vendor access management. So really trying to see how you're taking care of that.
Yeah.
A few other things that we look for on the high level is business continuity plans. So do you have a plan? Do you understand how you're going to respond in the event that something does go awry? And do you understand the potential impact that it has? Part of that would include a plan to access folks like us on the phone via cyber vendors, your broker. We don't have a claims rep on the phone, but that would be a helpful resource for you all as well. And then backup procedures would be one of the last ones. Imperative in the new era of ransomware. A lot of effective backup strategies can really save you and your abilities to get back up and running. So we'll take a pretty close look at those types of things. So point being is, even at a high level, you could tell that the apps are broader in scope. And then it's because we want to understand the details on these things, understand what the actual risk is, and then understand the protections in place to hopefully prevent those from occurring.
Yeah. And to add a little color to that, Bryan touched on a few really good points there, but, we've seen 3 iterations of an application rolled out over the last 3 to 4 years at Evolve. It started with a 1-page application where the business name, website, revenue got you practically a bindable quote for certain revenue brackets, right? When you talk about gross revenues, a lot of it is still tiered in the sense on our side. And Bryan, it might still be the same for you, that if you're talking businesses under a certain revenue threshold, there's still maybe more leniency on the application used or leniency on the types of controls that are required. We see that on our side at least. But once you start getting into 50 million, 75 million, over 100 million in gross sales, that's where the controls are an absolute necessity. Not saying that's not the case for smaller to middle market accounts, but the point is just there's some flexibility that we have given the size of the entity that we're trying to provide terms for. Yeah, so that's really what we've seen as well. As far as the second question goes, though, looking at, do we see these underwriting expectations becoming more stringent? Absolutely. We just rolled out a new application, like I mentioned recently, and a lot of that's trying to clarify questions that were slightly vague, getting a little bit more pointed with our questions, so that way there's not these half yes, half no answers, and we want to make sure that we're getting credible answers from our insureds.
Yeah, very good points. And I would certainly agree with regards to, revenue streams, revenue bands, and how we approach the application process. We do understand that if you're talking solely tools, a lot of these tools have a pretty hefty price tag, and not all organizations are going to be propped up to have, all of those in place. But that said, for the most part, when you think about cyber exposure, right, you're thinking about information, right, which is valuable for the bad actors. And then you're also thinking about what's the impact of this business being shut down for a period of time because of a breach. So typically with the smaller entities, it's going to be less impactful, right? So we do have the ability to, have some leniency on controls and procedures because of the risk changing a bit.
And I would say we've always, at KMRD, we've always recommended to our clients that you go through the underwriting process, even if you decide to make a business decision and not purchase the coverage. First of all, it's good to have a price point on the risk, on transferring that risk, right? But going through the application process, especially now, more so than 5-6 years ago, because there is more stringent questions, you're going to learn a lot more about your infrastructure and also your risk when it comes to your network. And by providing that document to, if you have an outsourced IT provider, providing that document and going through those questions, you're going to learn a lot about your infrastructure. So we always recommend that you go through that process anyway.
It's a great point. So Travis, I think we can probably lead with you on this one. As far as the philosophies of your organization or other organizations and most of the insurance carrier community as to why system scans are more important than backups and multi-factor authentication, endpoint detection, response, and encryption. Talk a little bit about the scans that are performed and the importance of them.
Yeah. And this dovetails nicely, right, with the application process, because like Bryan, myself, I've been talking about, nowadays there's a lot more questions on the application surrounding the types of cybersecurity controls that you have in place. And quite frankly, if you don't have some of the basic controls in place, such as multi-factor authentication, backups, et cetera, you may not even qualify for coverage nowadays. That's just the state of the market. A lot of insurance companies are using different types of vulnerability scans in their underwriting process. And what we're a lot of times trying to do is determine if there's open RDP ports or different exposures that the insured may not be aware of that we would like to tie the loose ends off on before providing terms. Evolve, we use a number of different things. We offer a number of different resources to our client base as well, to where they can take advantage of ongoing vulnerability scans after they purchase a policy with us. Bryan, I know you mentioned you use certain scans on the front end in the underwriting process. Can you go further in depth on that?
Sure. So specific to scans, I think there's benefit in them Whereas, so if you're going through an application and you're not able to check a box because you don't have a control or procedure, all you know is that you don't have it, right? These scans are nice because a lot of times, I'll use a brand name. I don't know if I'm supposed to, but like a security scorecard. Essentially what they're going to do is they're going to look at your organization and certain buckets, right? So they'll be able to identify if there's been any negative, claims activity, breaches. They'll be able to give some perspective on whether or not, there's information that's trading on the dark web. And they'll take all this, they'll see if systems are patched properly, et cetera. They'll take all this and they'll be able to put a score together for you. So it is a nice feature where you're getting feedback on how you actually stack up compared to some of your peer groups.
Yeah. And then the endpoint detection and response, as well as things like a SIM solution, security information event management, those are types of controls that we're starting to see become a requirement from our underwriters on some of the larger accounts. So accounts that we would call maybe more middle market, true middle market, 50 to 100 million in revenue or north of there. We're starting to see where those types of controls are becoming more relevant in the underwriting process, to where we want to see those in place prior to offering terms or competitive terms. We're even seeing on our end where a number of standard markets, right? Other insurers are beginning to reduce coverages if you don't have certain controls in place. I've seen markets in recent months where if you don't have an incident response plan, a written incident response plan in place, then you may or may not be able to qualify for the business interruption coverage, which is something Bryan touched on earlier, is a large exposure we're seeing across the board with a number of different events. So a lot of different things that are changing. There's a lot of markets out there, like I mentioned, if you don't have the MFA in place on remote access to the network, all business emails, et cetera, and you cannot check yes on that application, then you can't even qualify for coverage in whole.
Yeah.
And Travis, I think you have a really good point here, because a lot of the breaches we see revolve around the lack of these types of controls, EDR or kind of the next generation, which is XDR. And then a lot of businesses are saying to themselves, well, I've got my data in 3 places. Who cares if we get hit? We'll press a button and, magically everything will come back after we get hit with ransomware. But I think the big issue here is, one, ransomware really impacts business continuity, because when your computers get hit, in many cases, the execution of the ransomware attack damages the computers, right? The operating systems. And then the other issue is, depending on what data you look at, our data is around 75% of these attacks result in the theft of the business's proprietary information. It could be protected information. It could be electronic protected information. It could be IP, intellectual property. And sometimes that's more damaging than the actual attack itself. All right. So between business continuity and the theft of this data, that's really where the game is right now with these hackers. And you have to put these technologies in place to try and defend against it. And the reality is, these scans that we're talking about that check the firewalls, check devices, they're incredibly important, right? They're going to expose the technology that really has kind of the unlocked doors and windows that the hackers are looking for, that'll allow them to gain entry into these networks. And if you're not running these scans on a very regular basis, the odds are you're eventually going to get hit. So,
Gary, when you say a regular basis, could you expand upon how often these scans should be run? Is this something that you do up front, and then we're talking monthly, or what's the period that these scans should be run?
Yeah, look, the industry is changing quickly. A year and a half ago, people were saying quarterly. I don't think that's effective anymore. I mean, we're doing scans on at least a monthly basis for our clients, and clients that have higher risks. Sometimes we'll do these scans on the firewalls almost on a weekly basis, just to see if there's exposures there. So look, the reality is the industry is probably going to go to daily scans, just to try and find high risk vulnerabilities. Obviously, companies can't manage every vulnerability that's detected every day, but at least the knowledge and the information is out there, so the business can take corrective action quickly, before they get hit. Look, the hackers can scan these networks, millions of them, sometimes in hours. And if they stumble across a vulnerability on firewall or firewalls within the organization, they're going to pick their way in. That's unfortunately how it's working right now. So I would recommend, to answer your question directly, at least have every single external IP address scanned on a monthly basis, if not more frequently, depending on the technology you have access to.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great point.
All right, let's dive into the ugly side, claims. So plain and simple, what is the worst claim you have seen on the underwriting side?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Bryan, yeah, I can take a quick piece of that at least. You know, one of the few industry sectors that we've been getting, we've seen an increase in significant claims over the last year and a half at Evolve have been in the manufacturing, wholesale, and distribution space. And the main reason for that is they sit on very large business interruption, business income loss exposures. We've been talking about continuity plans, things along those lines. Well, you know, one of the largest claims to date that I experienced was a very large manufacturer. They were hit with a ransomware attack that shut their operations down. We were losing $1.2 million a day in lost income because they were that size. And it took us about 5 to 6 days to get their systems back up and running. And so because of that, you know, we experienced a full limit loss solely from the business income loss component, not to mention paying a $2.8 million ransom demand after we negotiated that down from 3.2 million. So those are industry sectors that we've seen kind of burning on our book of business, maybe more than other industry sectors over the last couple of years. And so because of that, we've had to make some sweeping adjustments from the underwriting perspective, where we're requiring higher levels of controls for manufacturing, wholesale distribution. And really we're testing it to the fact that hackers have figured out every CFO at one of those firms is going to be able to tell you how much money they're losing every single day that they cannot operate. And therefore they're a prime target to get higher ransom payments paid because they have to get back up and running in a timely manner. So kind of a trend we've seen, but also the largest claim that I've dealt with to date was one of those very large manufacturing groups.
And Travis, did they have enough limits? Obviously not. If it was a full limits loss, I suspect they had a lot of out-of-pocket costs.
We had a $5 million policy limit in place for them. It was a full limit loss. I believe the total loss was like $6.8 million. So they were still on the hook for about 1.8 million.
Yeah. Yeah, so for me, I'll take this more from a claims trends perspective, right? So, you know, Travis was alluding to ransomware. Ransomware, being that I've been working on this product for almost 20 years, is a fairly new type of approach. It's almost comical at this point, whereas, so cyber extortion was always a part of these programs. And so if you're talking internally, right, at a certain point in time, the extortion demands, they were typically in the low thousands. If they were large, they were tens of thousands of dollars. So the allocation of premium towards those types of events was minuscule, right? So you might be able to buy $1 million in extortion coverage back in the day for like $1,000. That certainly changed. You know, so just in ransomware, the trend continues to go in the wrong direction. And in addition to manufacturing, I've seen a lot of ransom events at healthcare, a lot for public entity, especially if you're talking about things like energy distribution, any sort of power distribution, water treatment centers, those types of things. Schools, so districts, K through 12 schools, have seen an increase in ransom events there as well. And then I would say law firms and accounting firms also. So we certainly follow, you know, that trend, and what it does is it leads to changes in structure, right? So certainly have become more robust in seeking premiums to support the potential for extortion. But even ransomware itself, so the bad actors, they're savvy, right? So where it may be, hey, we have access to your system, we're extorting you for $1 million, pay us or else. Now the threat is we also have all of your data. So if you don't pay us, you're not going to get access to your system, and we're also going to release all your data So now you have a liability claim on your hands in addition to the ransom. So, and that hits another part of the policy. So, these trends have certainly lent to an eye-opening event where various coverage parts of these insurance policies could be triggered just by a single situation, right? And so to my earlier points, for a few years now, probably about 10, a lot of discussion on systemic exposure. So when certain vulnerabilities like Kaseya, Log4j start to show their face, on the carrier side, typically we're trying to understand, how those, what vulnerabilities they're using to implement their tools. And then also on the other side of the house, what can the client do to help protect themselves? And, Gary could probably talk to, the implementation process because, they would be scanning for vulnerabilities and help clients understand what those were. And so we asked those questions in the underwriting process to hopefully understand the protections, and then with the hopes that we're diminishing the potential for systemic exposure on our portfolios.
Brian, would
Yeah.
you say that you think clients are purchasing the appropriate coverage as far from a limit perspective and a coverage perspective as well? Just kind of on a broad spectrum.
So that would go by revenue band. So I work for, all entities of all sizes. So from the ground up to multinational, I would say majority of the multinationals certainly do. They cannot even find as much capacity as they want and need. And we're talking towers of $100 million to $200 million. There have been losses in that realm. That is, really why they have that appetite, because we've seen, tens of millions of dollars in loss on certain towers in that space. Middle market, I would say typically, so when I talk middle market, I'm talking mostly like 250 million in revenue up to $1 billion. The coverage has gotten expensive. So some clients have diminished the capacity to afford the premium. And that's their own choice, right? They have the potential to take on some of that risk themselves if they're big enough. And then the smaller entities is where I find that the coverage is, it's still affordable and certainly could save an organization from being shut down if the event is extreme enough, right? So I would say in the smaller business space that customers are not buying as much as they could and probably should, is my opinion.
Okay.
I think one thing that's important to discuss also is what's in these policies, right? We've had victims come to us where we engage them to help them recover from ransomware, pay the ransom payment, and they'll show up and say, hey, I got $1 million of coverage. This is great. And then you look at the policy and what's allocated for the ransom payment is $10,000. And the ransom payment could be $500,000, and it really is covering, compliance and legal fees and potential fines and PR and things like that. So they think they have this massive policy, but when you look at the limits, it's a problem for the organization, and they thought they were in a good place, and they were probably sold something that even maybe the agent didn't even understand, and obviously the buyer didn't either. I think it's very important for everyone to understand what they actually have.
Yeah. And two quick numbers for you guys, just based off of Q4 of 2021 statistics from Evolve. Our average ransom payment was $322,000. And unlike Bryan, Evolve's focus primarily accounts under the 250 million in revenue range. So that's not really skewed by large corporate data. And to Gary's point earlier on the data exfiltration, where hackers are also stealing that data, we found that 84% of the ransomware attacks we were dealing with were including data exfiltration.
Yeah, so very close to our numbers.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Hey, Brian, I have a class of business that I found was really getting hit hard on claims. And I found it to be, your IT managed service providers, companies that basically, do cloud hosting or that type of stuff for a bunch of clients. We had one situation where a company had backdoors into a bunch of clients, and they were doing, software updates, software maintenance, reboot, that type of stuff. Long story short, the hacker got in. So their clients were actually primarily cryptocurrency exchanges. So not necessarily Coinbase, but they're exchanges, smaller exchanges all over the place. And they had those were the clients that they were servicing. And they had back doors to provide, updates to the software, that type of thing. Hacker got in, hacked our insured, and was able to basically siphon off 500 Bitcoin from all the different exchanges collectively. So about 500 Bitcoin. If you look at the price of Bitcoin right now, I think it's like $40,000. So you can see, the type of costs that would have. And that was just one little service provider. The fear for me is if, you have somebody get in, they basically have backdoors to all their clients. So if you're a managed service provider, it's definitely, you're a target, because the hackers know that if they get you, they get all your clients as well. And if you're buying services from a service provider, you just got to take a closer look at who you're using, make sure that their security controls are up to date, and that they don't just have, the keys to your kingdom as well. Because if they get hit, you get hit. That's just one area that we've seen, Brian.
So Chris, I think this is a really good point here. I mean, we've dealt with probably half a dozen decent sized MSPs that have been hit over the years. And these hacking groups often target MSPs, first of all. And then second, when they access these MSPs, they typically get 100% of their clients. Like every workstation, every server that MSP monitors and manages will be a victim of the attack also. And these attacks are so damaging, most of the time the MSPs can't recover. They don't have enough people. Yeah,
if it's your control, you have no way of knowing that it's actually a hacker, because from your system's perspective, it's just your MSP coming in to do whatever it is, what they normally do, an update or maintenance or whatever. So you can have the best controls in town and it still won't matter, because from your system's perspective, it's not a hacker. It's your service provider coming in to do their services. And before you know it, they give themselves admin access if they don't already have it, and they hit your system entirely. So MSP has been very, very difficult.
So to your point, though, it's important for business to do third-party due diligence, which is a whole other conversation. But you have to ask the tough questions of these vendors that have access to your systems. What cybersecurity measures do they have in place to protect themselves? Is it being independently audited, or does the MSP take the position, oh, we're IT folks, we know what we're doing, you don't have to worry about us, and then they get hit? So it's very important that businesses do cyber due diligence.
That's a great point, Gary. It's not just internally, it's who you're working with as well.
Absolutely.
Making sure they have the right controls in place. Thanks for that. Chris, while we have you warmed up here, let's talk a little bit from your side, from the wholesale broker side. But talk about the timeline, a renewal timeline, maybe even a first time purchasing cyber coverage timeline. Why is it important to start this early and get ahead of it, especially in the current marketplace?
All right, so just first, right off the bat, every state has basically a non-renewal requirement where you have to notify insureds that their program could potentially be non-renewed or terms can change. Every carrier that I'm working with is sending that out blanket right now. So if you have a policy in place currently, either 60 or 90 days, depending on where you are, you're going to receive a notice saying, your policy is being non-renewed. Upon a submission, we may look at it and offer terms. And they're doing that because terms are changing, and depending on the responses that you provide in your application, you may not qualify for coverage with them anymore. So they may look to non-renew you. So we say, start 90 to no earlier than 60. Definitely start 90. Filling out applications, talking to your IT people, getting the applications in order, sending them to your brokers so your brokers can take a look at them. And because we know what the marketplace requires, we know where the holes are. We can look at your application and basically say, hey, look, this is a problem. You don't have multi-factor authentication for administrative accounts, or remote desktop logins, or you don't have any endpoint detection and response. These are things that the markets are requiring. If you get that to us early before your policy expires, you have time to implement those. So we know that MFA is not something you do by, this Friday. It's a process to get people signed up, to get the systems implemented. So you want to save yourself time. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to, if you submit to the markets, 90, 60 days in advance, that doesn't mean you're going to get a quote, this week. A lot of the times the quotes are coming in last second just because, I'm sure the two underwriters here can attest to this. The submission volume is huge. Everybody's marketing. So, quotes are coming in late. They're coming in late in the process. But if you start early, what you do is you give yourself enough time to fix the problems that you have to make yourself attractive to underwriters. So if I would say, as soon as you get that non-renewal notice, usually 90 days, start working on your application, start figuring out what controls you have and what you may be missing and how to fix them. But certainly no later than 60 days. If it comes in, if you're one of the insureds who, you get your app in a week before the renewal, and it turns out you don't have any of the coverages or any of the security controls that you need, you're going to be faced with a non-renewal, and the carrier is going to hang their hat on the non-renewal notice that they sent out, 3 months ago. And they're going to say, sorry, sir, we're non-renewing and there's nothing we can do. Can we have an extension? No extension. We're implementing MFA. It'll be done in 3 weeks. Sorry, they're not even entertaining you. They want MFA in place now. They want it in place before the account renews, or you're staring at a non-renewal. So trust me, I have this situation constantly where we have accounts that come in, they submit the application late, and they say MFA is in progress. It's slated to, be completed, a month into the policy period. Can they give us an extension, or can they just renew? The carriers are saying no for the most part. Now, there are some out there who may give you an extension, but it'll be at a ridiculous rate. They may jack up your retentions. They may cut your limits. They're not going to give you an extension on the old program. There are other carriers who may renew you, but they'll put a ransomware co-insurance or small sublimits. You're going to be paying, 40, 50% co-insurance while the time that the MFA is in progress. And then once it's fully implemented and you tell them, they'll remove it. But very difficult environment for cyber, renewals. And the best way to guard against it is to start early. That way you find out where the holes are and you have time to fix them. You need to have time to fix them before your policy renews. That's really all I can say.
Absolutely. And I would add from our standpoint, getting out early also, you get an idea of what controls you need in place if you need to put them in place, and also helps to create competition within the marketplace for your business. Getting out early, as opposed to having potentially one quote option late in the game, getting out early and really getting the pulse of the market for your particular industry and business is very important, again, to securing the best coverage and for the best price. So along with those potential measures that you need to put in place, it definitely helps to create competition and give you the best renewal offer well ahead of time.
Yeah, I would agree to that.
So on to our cybersecurity expert, Gary. If you want to go through both these, how is espionage infiltrated ransomware? And then how do you see this progressing into the future?
Sure. Yeah, like if you look at the evolution of ransomware, it started out as a couple $1,000s years ago. Then they started hitting these businesses with larger and larger extortion amounts, 50, 100,000. Then we started seeing millions. And then we started seeing tens of millions for some very large companies. And then what the hackers were realizing was businesses were taking some proactive approaches to protect their data through various types of backup solutions. So what was occurring was business would get hit, right? The hackers would invest all this time breaking into the system, hitting them with ransomware. The businesses would then say, hey, we got recoverable data. We don't need to pay this ransom. And then the hackers are like, all right, that's not working anymore. What do I do now? How do I pivot? So they pivoted into this data extortion business, where when they gain access to the system, once they conduct their surveillance and understand the type of environment they're in, they will quickly move to start offloading as much data as possible in some instances, hundreds of gigabytes, and in some cases, terabytes of data they will remove from the system. And for a lot of businesses, they have no technology in place that's going to set off alarms that this data is being removed from the network. Most businesses, most executives, even boards think that, some alarm system is going to go off and warn their internal IT or managed service provider that this is occurring. But our experience is that that's not typically the case. It's very rare that we get involved with a case while an active attack is going on. So they moved into this data extortion as a methodology to basically guarantee that they get paid. And if they're working in an industry that has very stringent laws around that data, people's identities, healthcare information, banking, things like that, what often will happen is even if that business has recoverable backups, meaning the hackers didn't destroy the backups, the business will be forced to pay the ransom because they will post this data on their dark website. So all these different hacking groups have their own dark web websites, and they will start posting the data as a threat. So if the business refuses to pay, they will basically tell the business, hey, you don't believe us? Check this out. Hit this link on the dark web, and you'll see 1 to 10% of your data posted. And someone from the business or a law firm, or more likely a cyber firm, will take that data, show it back to the client, and be like, you guys got a problem, right? Your data has definitely been stolen. Here's proof. Sometimes the hackers will even send screen captures of the various types of data that they've stolen as proof that the data has been taken. And then the next step in terms of evolution is really the contacting of the data. That's another huge problem right now, where businesses are like, we have our data on backups. Who cares that they stole the data? Then the hackers start emailing or making phone calls to the clients of the victim, right? They may start releasing the information to news sources, things like that, indicating that, look, we got into this business, we stole their data, here's proof of the data that we stole. And then they start extorting individuals, right? Or other businesses associated with the victim of the ransomware attack. So you can see the hackers basically keep escalating this, right? It's a cat and mouse game. It's very much like the military, where we build the state-of-the-art stealth fighter and no one can detect it for a couple of years. And all of a sudden, a foreign country has figured out a way to pick up our stealth fighters, and now we got to reinvent it. So in this world, the cyber world it's very much the same. In terms of what we're starting to see and what concerns us is wiper malware, where the hackers will actually go in and destroy the entire environment, wipe the entire environment. So you walk into your business and the computers don't even have an operating system on them. The servers are, destroyed. That's an issue. That was what we saw a little bit in the Ukraine invasion of Ukraine, right? Russia launched some wiper malware. And then there's also talk in the intelligence world about hackers maybe moving more away from ransomware and focusing more on the data theft, right? Because it's a lot easier to execute. There is a less likelihood that the attack is going to be picked up. And in the end, that's what most businesses care about anyway, right? Is what happens with my data because of all the legal compliance, and business operations that are impacted, with that type of data theft. So I think we're looking at that. And then obviously everyone always says the complexity gets greater, and that's just the evolution, and that's the truth. So that's really what we're starting to see and what we're worrying about now. But I think the big issue is, many businesses, small, medium in size, aren't really putting the correct controls. And we keep using this word over and over again, aren't putting the correct controls and doing the right things to protect themselves. And what you're seeing right now is insurance companies and cyber companies aligning, right? Years past, we didn't really see that. But I think everyone in this industry right now is realizing, hey, things need to be done, and they need to be done quickly and properly in order to protect these networks and protect this data. And I think many businesses aren't budgeting, and they're not thinking about these things. And they're just going to say, hey, we've got a cyber policy, right? And if we get hit, they'll pay out, right? But that's not going to work anymore.
Right.
One of the analogies, Gary, that I use with my clients is, you have a fleet of vehicles, you have a driver safety program, you have a formal document that says, hey, don't drive while drunk, buckle your seatbelt, don't drive while you're on your cell phone. You have a maintenance program, right, to take care of the vehicles, to make sure that there's not an issue with them while your employees are driving them. Well, it's 2022, and we have to kind of treat your network in the same manner. You got to have the right, cyber hygiene and a plan in place. And there's no difference. And that's the mind shift of our clients. They have to start thinking, I have these controls for other parts of my business. I need them in this part. And I think we're getting there, but not there completely yet.
And Bryan, interesting point. Look what happened when COVID hit. We went from everyone basically working in an office to everyone working from home, right? Connecting from these networks into the corporate environments, and they'll sit at their home behind a modem, no firewall, right? Dave, their 10-year-old kid downloads a malicious game or accesses something they're not supposed to, and potentially, and we've seen it moves into the corporate environment. There's lots of things that businesses need to put in place that unfortunately many are not doing, but with the right resources, they can do and make very significant gains in their security posture. So
I think we got Colin. This last slide, maybe Gary, in 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great segue into this last slide, Gary, is that aside from the controls, talk about the importance of employee training and awareness and participation in preventing these breaches, and talk about how this is potentially in many aspects a people problem as opposed to a systems problem.
Yeah, so the reality is most of the issues with cybersecurity come down to people, right? So let's define that a little bit better. Most of the time we'll hear people say, well, let's just train everyone on phishing and spear phishing and various types of social engineering scams. We'll be okay because almost all networks are broken in that way. Depending on who you're talking to, right, and what the company is, they'll say to you, 90% of cyber attacks are because of people falling for scams. I'll tell you from our experience, that's not that high. It's probably closer to the 50 to 60% mark, where these types of attacks originate from someone clicking on something or doing something or giving up something. But there's also a pretty significant component of that number that is the result of technical problems with the network. But let's start with the people, right? So any business that's online, you have to train your employees all the way up to the executive teams on the various types of cyber threats, right? If you think about LinkedIn is a gold mine for hackers. Why? They'll find out who the executives are, who the board members are, right? Who the key employees are. It's not hard to figure out people's email addresses anymore. It's first dot last name or first letter of their first name plus the last name. And the hackers will deliver these emails to these key people within the business. And sometimes if they're not trained properly, they'll click on a link that will initiate the download of malicious code. They will open an attachment that's malicious. Or more commonly, what we see is they give up their credentials, right? You give up the credentials to the VPN, to your email systems, things like that, and you don't have the proper controls in place, you're going to get hit. That's the reality of it, right? You can give up your credentials and a hacker could be in the network in minutes. That's how quickly it happens nowadays. So having a formalized cybersecurity awareness training program in place that focuses on phishing and spear phishing and business email compromise, right, wire fraud is imperative, right? It's not even optional. Like a business that doesn't have a formalized plan, not like, hey guys, by the way, don't click on stuff that doesn't, that's not good for our business. Just be aware that's not training, right? Have a formalized program in place that is actionable and have simulated phishing, right? You have to test all of your employees. Are they paying attention? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Or do we have certain employees that are high risk for our business? So I think that's important also. And then let's talk about the other people component. And then I think we're going to roll into Q&A. It starts at the top. This is what I tell every size organization, regardless if you're $1 million a year or multi-billion-dollar, it starts at the top, right? The executives, the board has to take this stuff seriously. They have to budget for it. And it's basically passed down, right, throughout the organization, because it does start at the top. And if the executives and the vice presidents and the managers aren't taking this stuff seriously, then you have people under them that won't take it seriously either. And we're in a place now where literally one mistake by one employee can shut your entire operation down for 10 days. It's that simple and cost you millions and millions of dollars. So businesses really need to train. And then most importantly, they need to understand where they have risk and put controls in place to mitigate that risk. You can't mitigate every single risk. We get that, but these risks have to be prioritized. And many of the things that everyone on this call have been talking about are the key elements of building a more secure environment and a more secure business.
I get this example a lot. I'll get an email and it'll look pretty real, asking me to click this link to get to an unpaid invoice or a late invoice, and I got to pay it now, or legal proceedings are going to be brought against me, something like that.
Yep.
It's very easy to get duped, especially if you're in a business that's handling hundreds of emails a day and you're just constantly processing and churning through emails. You get one, it says, please pay this late invoice. You click on the link and now all of a sudden everything gets locked up. It's very easy. So you really do need to have a culture and training. I know our company does training regularly where our IT team will send us fake emails. And if we click on one, then we got to go back to more training. So it really starts from the top, and it's very important. It's very easy. We see it all the time. They click on something that they were not that they didn't realize it, but they were just moving a mile a minute. They were busy. They were stressed, whatever. They're working at home. Their kids are screaming. It's very easy to just click on something. So that's one that we see a lot is please click on this invoice, or, please pay the invoice.
Yeah. So no clicking on weird links, everybody. Don't click on anything you don't know. No crazy cat videos or anything like that. Keep them all out of your computer.
But I think to Chris's point, something that should be mentioned that I think catches a lot of people is often these emails come from people you work with, right? Their accounts have been compromised, or the hackers will create a lookalike account and send you an email, and you recognize it as, oh, that's my boss, that's my colleague, that's the CEO. I better do this. And that's how a lot of events occur through these types of.
Just one more point on that stuff as well. So we're talking a lot about, phishing attacks and people as the problem. The other aspect of that is physical security, right? So making sure that you use clean desk policies, make sure you have effective passwords in place, making sure that your corporation's adhering to those types of things, because that's another way to get your data stolen.
Very true.
Questions. If anyone has a question, feel free to type it in there in the question bar. We do have one here. Question is, how should I know how much limit to buy? How should I know what limit of cyber liability I should buy? I'll open that up to anybody and everybody.
Go ahead.
I'll be quick. One of the quick tools that we've recommended in the past, in the event that you have high volumes of sensitive information, whether that's credit card information, healthcare information, or personally identifiable information, is data breach calculators are relatively easy to access. It's simple. You could put a ballpark figure as to what you think that record count would look like, and then it would generate costs associated with losing that information. That's costs associated with notification, hourly billables of forensic, data breach attorneys, et cetera, in order to make sure you're staying compliant with all the foreign, federal, state requirements surrounding notification. So that's one way to view it. Bryan, I'll let you take the rock from there.
That's a great one. And frankly, I haven't spoken of those tools in a while. So my response was going to be much more baseline, whereas obviously you have experts in the field like Chris that are helping the clients navigate through, and I imagine he has the ability to benchmark against your peers based on his portfolio. And then the other thing is, it's not very hard for the carriers to put together multiple options. We don't want to spend our time putting a dozen options on the table, but it's pretty simple to show you the difference between a 1 million, 3 million, and 5 million limit and the cost associated with that. So I would say just get a quote and you'll at least see a few options.
I would say pure benchmarking in cyber is not as useful as it is in other lines of coverage like D&O or EPL, because it really is kind of like the blind leading the blind. Nobody really knows. What I've been doing is just asking insureds, okay, here's a scenario. your company is shut down for 2 weeks. What kind of revenues are you going to lose? And if you had to replace the network entirely, like all new hardware, all new software, what would that cost? They come back, they figure out a number, and then I basically just multiply it by 2.5, because you're going to have that business interruption cost, you're going to have the computer replacement costs, then you're going to have the actual ransom, which you're probably going to have to pay, and then you're going to have all the other costs, customer notification, if regulatory potentially, if there's credit cards involved, you're going to have PCI, third-party lawsuits. So I've been really trying to ask insureds, just think of it in those terms. If your network was offline for 2 weeks or a week, whatever, what is that going to cost? Like, how many revenues are you going to not generate? What kind of profits are you going to lose by not being able to function? And then what's it going to cost to actually replace the entire network? $1 million? All right, you probably want a $3 million limit. If it's $2 million, you may want a $5 million limit. And that's just our benchmark. Again, it's an inexact science. There's not a ton of data out there because we don't know what are the hackers going to choose to ransom you for. There's not a scientific number for that. They can choose whatever they want that they feel that you're going to pay, and if you have the insurance, you're probably going to pay it. So that's just my approach. It's an imperfect one, but we live in an imperfect world here, so it's the best that we're doing with.
It's good insight, Chris. We have about 2 minutes left. So we're running out of time here, but we did just have a good question come up. Talking about smaller middle market accounts that are looking to get a contract requiring higher limits, that higher limits in the markets are really willing to provide. So from the carrier standpoint, how are you guys handling those types of requests where smaller, middle-size company needs high limits per a contract, but typically they can't get them within the market? Is there a way around that, or is there a way that you guys can underwrite to that?
The best thing you could do is to increase the third-party limit, because that usually is what satisfies the contract, while leaving the first-party limits at like $1 million or $2 million, whatever the base number is. So say you need, $10 million for a contract. Maybe you have a primary 5, but all the first party coverages are sublimited to 2 or 2.5. So that would be like your business interruption, your extortion, data recovery, those type of coverages. You keep those sublimited down, but your third party liabilities at 5, and then you get an excess carrier to do 5x of 5, where they do not drop and follow any of the first party sublimits. That's really the best way we can do it, because trust me, if you're putting up 5 if you're buying $10 million of limits and it's including all the first party coverages up to $10 million, it's going to be so expensive that the contract's almost not even going to be worth it. All the money you're making is going to go to your cyber premium. So the way that we've been trying to compromise there has just been sublimiting down all the first party coverages. I don't know if you guys have other, if you guys agree with that or not.
That was exactly my recommendation. We'll do a 1 million first party, 5 million third party to satisfy a lot of those $5 million requests. And it's generally speaking, like you mentioned, Chris, it's the network security liability, privacy liability language that they're looking to have those limit requirements for. So in a lot of cases, we can satisfy the contract doing those split limits there.
Great. That's all we have for today. Thank you everyone for your time. I hope this was informative and you come away with some valuable insight. Our contact information for all our panelists has been up here for a little bit if you'd like to reach out to them with any further questions. And you can always contact Bryan or myself. Again, this was recorded, so we will be following up with a link to the recording if you would like to catch up on anything you may have missed or share the information with your coworkers. Thanks again, guys. I appreciate your time and your expertise and insight today. I think that was very well run, and that was great information for everybody. And everyone else, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.